What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and finally Zen 3 is here. The wait is over, it's out. In this one we have the flagship Ryzen 9 5950X, so the 16 core, and the Ryzen 9 5900X, the 12 core part. There is an 8 core chip and a 6 core chip, and we'll be looking at those in future content, so make sure you check back out. And while you're there, why not give us a subscribe, like, hit the bell icon, do all our YouTube stuff. Check out our main kitguru.net website, it really helps us out. But let's jump further into this review. If we start out with the CPU architecture, Zen 3 is technically a new CPU architecture, as pointed out by AMD. So the big difference versus Zen 2 is that now we have an 8-core CCX with a single slab of 32MB L3 cache, and that's a difference versus the 4-core 16MB L3 cache CCXs that we saw for Zen 2. So the big benefit here is that all 8 cores on that single CCX get direct access to the 32 megs of L3 cache, whereas previously with Zen 2, Core 0 on the initial CCX might have needed to jump across Infinity Fabric to access more than its 16 megs of L3 cache on the CCX, and that gives you a latency penalty. So one of the big benefits, according to AMD, of this larger pool of on CCX L3 cache is latency. Another area where Zen 3 is improved is the maximum boost clock speeds. The 16 core is now 4.9 GHz maximum boost clock, and the 12 core is 4.8 GHz maximum boost clock. Now, of course, that has the same caveats as Zen 2, where it's single core boost clock, and it depends on your cooling configuration and other Precision Boost 2 metrics. But as AMD is still using the same TSMC 7nm process node, we actually don't see any notable improvements in base frequency. In fact, you get a 100 MHz reduction on the base frequency of the 16-core 5950X versus its Zen 2 predecessor, and the 5900X 12-core is also 100 MHz base clock slower versus the 3900XT 12-core. AMD does, however, highlight that the same silicon design enhancements that they applied with the 3000XT processors are present on the 5000X processors, so we expect the boost clock behavior to be more akin to the 3000XT, which was higher than the original 3000X processors. I guess with those two key differentiators for Zen 3 highlighted in the 8-core CCX with a larger pool of L3 cache on CCX, and also the enhanced boost frequencies, they are the main differences for Zen 3 highlighted. Now, there are other differences, including an improved L1 branch target buffer, improved branch prediction, reduced latency for select float and integer operations, and also higher load and store bandwidth. But in the interest of time in this video, because we've got plenty to get through, we'll let you jump on over to the Kit Guru website to check out more details in our written article if you're interested in the Zen 3 architecture. I think the key point to take away, though, is with all the architectural improvements for Zen 3, AMD is advertising a 19% increase in IPC, and that's a sizable gain to go from generation to generation, especially when Zen 2 already had good IPC performance anyway. Looking at the CPU specifically, the 5900X is a 12-core 24-thread processor with 3.7 GHz base and 4.8 GHz maximum boost frequency with a 105 watt TDP. It comes in at $549 US or £510 in the UK. And the flagship 5950X is a 16-core 32-thread processor, 3.4 GHz base, 4.9 GHz maximum boost, 105 watt TDP, and a $799 US or £750 UK price. And I guess a point on box cooler is that neither of these chips comes with a box cooler, and quite frankly on 12 and 16 core enthusiast parts, I'm perfectly fine with that decision. In terms of other factors such as connectivity, AM4 platform support, memory frequency, PCIe generation, etc., it's all the same as Zen 2, and the reason there is because AMD uses the same central I/O die as is used on Zen 2. And that really speaks volumes about the genius of AMD's chiplet design. They can simply take out the existing 12nm I/O die from Zen 2, plug in some new Zen 3 CCXs, and voila, you have a Zen 3 processor. That really is genius because all those bugs, the production issues, etc., which you would assume have existed on that Zen 2 I/O die, they're just not existing anymore. So just in case it's not perfectly clear, this is still 16 plus 4 PCIe Gen 4 lanes, still the same memory support, so DDR4 3600 is going to be a sweet spot because of the one-to-one divider. In terms of competition, the 5950X realistically has none. So the only competitor, I guess, for the 5950X is the now slightly cheaper Zen 2 3950X that it replaces. The Ryzen 9 5900X has competition most notably from the 10-core Intel Core i9 10900K, so their mainstream flagship. That processor is slightly more expensive, so to the slightly cheaper side, you actually get some competition from the Core i9 10850K, which is basically just a fractionally slower 10900K, but it's about £100 cheaper. And you also get some competition from obviously the Zen 2 12 cores that this part is replacing. For our test system, we're using both the Gigabyte X570 Aorus Master and the Asus X570 ROG Crosshair 8 Hero motherboard. So both of these motherboards have the latest BIOS revision, and that's a G7 1100 from AMD. Memory comes in the form of a 2x16GB of Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 3600 MHz. Cooling comes in the form of a Fractal 280mm AIO with 1600 RPM fan speeds. Our graphics card of choice is the Gigabyte RTX 3080 Eagle OC. So this triple fan factory overclocked graphics card is a performance powerhouse and will deliver the frame rates necessary for us to identify performance differences between these high-end processors on offer. And we also use a Noctua NH-D15S Chromax black cooler to validate some of our additional testing data. The power supply is the Seasonic Prime TX1000 1kW titanium rated unit. Identical hardware is used for the Intel test system, but of course we switch out the motherboard, and that's to an MSI Meg Z490 Ace. With this motherboard, when you apply XMP with the 10900K processor, it runs in its turbo duration unlimited state, so it runs at 4.9 GHz maximum frequency all through testing without dropping down the tau and the time delay power values. If you want more details on our test hardware, test procedure, the games, the settings, etc., head on over to the Kikaroo website. In terms of overclocking, we managed to actually hit 4.7 GHz all-core frequency on both of the chips, which is highly impressive. And that was using actually sensible voltages, so about 1.33 volts load voltage on both of the chips. And then if we give a quick word on Infinity Fabric overclocking, we did try to hit the 2000 MHz target that AMD highlighted, but we couldn't actually get higher than 1866 MHz. We have highlighted this to AMD, and they did say that a GISA update is coming, and that's likely to improve the behavior with 4000 MHz RAM and 2000 MHz Infinity Fabric. So we'll have to check back in the future with our upcoming other 5000 series reviews to see if we can indeed hit that 2000 MHz fabric clock. Let's look at the numbers. The 5950X is 11% faster than the 3950X it supersedes, and that performance gap widens drastically when the clock speed limiting shackles are removed. Overclocked to 4.7 GHz all-core, AMD's 16-core 5950X is not too far from double the performance of Intel's mainstream flagship 10900K. Just let that point settle in for a second. The 12-core 5900X blasts past the 10900K with a 35% performance lead, versus the incumbent Zen 2 12-core. AMD's new offering is an impressive 17% quicker. Manually overclocked to a lofty 4.7 GHz, the 5900X is able to offset a 4-core deficit and leapfrog the stock 3950X 16-core chip's performance. Cinebench NT numbers from the Zen 3 big boys are fantastic. We see the 5950X hitting around 3.85 to 4 GHz all-core frequency in the demanding Cinebench NT workload. This clock speed value holds up well using A or AIO cooling on our tested motherboards. This is a very similar clock speed to the 3950X it replaces, and looks to be held back by one of the default Precision Boost 2 limits. We see the 5900X run at around 4.3 to 4.4 GHz, which is impressive for the 12-core chip directly out of the box, as it's around 300 MHz faster than even the 3900XT 12-core processor at its stock frequency. Cinebench 1T performance sees AMD's Zen 3 chips cruise to what seems like easy victories thanks to the new architectural improvements. Nothing can come close to the Zen 3 architecture in this test, and when the improvements to boost clock frequency and residency are coupled in, Zen 3's performance lead is colossal. This result bodes well for performance in lightly threaded tasks, including games, going forward. Interestingly, we see both processors operating above their rated maximum boost frequency. In the case of the 5950X, we observed clock values as high as 50 MHz, even if only for small periods of time. That's 5 GHz on Zen 3. Nice. The usual maximum boost clock, however, was around 4.95 GHz. For the 5900X, we also saw clocks on a single core run at 4.95 GHz, despite the maximum rated boost clock being 4.8 GHz, so this chip is over-delivering using the current AGISA version. This is a fantastic outcome for boost clocks on Zen 3 CPUs, and is notably higher than what we saw on Zen 2, even in the Ryzen 3000 XT form. Blender shows similar advantageous performance trends for Zen 3 that we saw in Cinebench, but this time with a more popular real-world workload. The new 5950X renders the frame 20 seconds quicker than the Zen 2 16-core 3950X. That represents a 7.7% render time decrease, which is very respectable. Unlocking the clock speed shackles boosts the 5950X performance by another couple of big notches too. Frequency improvements help to boost the 5900X to a 43-second render time improvement over the Zen 2 3900 XT. A render time decrease of 13% when going from the old 12-core to the new 12-core highlights the improvements that AMD is bringing into play with Zen 3. Versus Intel's Core i9-10900K, the Ryzen 9 5900X is in a completely different performance league despite costing roughly the same. The 5950X boosts to around 4.45 GHz using PBO. Peak is slightly higher, but after a few minutes of all-core loading, 4.45 GHz looks to be a stable point for Precision Boost Overdrive. The 5900X comes in similar with an all-core Precision Boost Overdrive operating clock of a little over 4.4 GHz after extended periods of heavy load. These PBO numbers are actually really good, especially for the 16-core, which runs about 500 MHz faster than its out-of-the-box frequency, which is a very impressive gain. Even the 12-core registers about 50 to 100 MHz higher, so clearly Precision Boost Overdrive is doing a pretty good job with Zen 3. V-Ray, another multi-threaded rendering application, continues the performance trend for excellent Zen 3 numbers. Architectural enhancements, most notably the larger slab of directly accessible L3 cache on each CCX, result in strong performance for Zen 3 and 7-zip compression. Decompression performance shows a similar trend, but it is more core count biased. That performance victory for the 5900X over the Intel 10900K is a massive 53%. Handbrake in our H.264 test configuration struggles to leverage all cores on the 12 and 16 core parts. This brings architecture and boost clocks more into the picture and is why we see very strong Ryzen 5000 performance numbers. Our Handbrake H.265 test is more cache and clock speed sensitive as it often lingers at sub 60% core utilization even on a 16 core chip, for example. Nevertheless, the architectural improvements for Zen 3 do a superb job at delivering new heights for our H.265 test setup. This time, the performance leads versus Zen 2 and Coffee Lake are sizable for both the Zen 3 chips. Memory bandwidth numbers for Zen 3 are basically the same as with Zen 2. That comes as no surprise given the use of the same I/O die and DDR4 subsystem. Memory latency performance, however, looks to have improved for Zen 3 versus Zen 2. This is likely to be another latency benefit that helps gaming performance. Intel's Comet Lake Core i9-10900K is still slicker when it comes to raw memory latency numbers though. F1 2020 sees AMD making a positive start in gaming performance. At 1080p with an RTX 3080, the performance increases for Zen 3 over Zen 2 are evident, especially to high refresh rate gamers. Intel is still slightly faster at the top of the chart with a 4.9 GHz plus 10900K, but AMD's Zen 3 chips have reduced the Intel margin of victory convincingly. At 1440p, we see the margins of performance difference narrow and all the options are fine in this game. GTA 5 spells our first victory for AMD with Zen 3, and this is a noteworthy one. GTA 5 is an old but still immensely popular and demanding DX11 title. AMD's Zen 3 chips beating the Core i9-10900K in this test is notable given AMD's historic struggles in the Intel favouring GTA title. Equally important is the sizable performance increase for Zen 3 versus Zen 2. This now makes the new Ryzen 5000 series chips excellent choices for high refresh rate gaming with the GTA 5, whereas previously Intel was the superior option in that use case. Increasing the graphics workload to 1440p sees the same trend hold true. Zen 3 is still a little faster than the 10900K, and the performance improvement over Zen 2 is still sizable. Metro Exodus flips the chart topping position back to Intel's Core i9-10900K. Here, Zen 3 shows another strong performance uplift versus Zen 2, but the Intel offering is slightly faster with its aggressive clock speeds. The key takeaway for Zen 3 is that it is now close enough to the 10900K's performance levels to be considered a smart option for high refresh rate gaming in this title, whereas that was not necessarily the case on Zen 2. 1440p shows the same performance trend, but the margins are constricted to the point where Zen 2, Zen 3 and Comet Lake all do well. Red Dead Redemption 2 using the DX12 API sees Intel maintain another top spot performance result. In this modern title, Zen 3 is barely any quicker than Zen 2 using our chosen performance settings. High refresh rate gaming snobs, including myself, may be better impressed by the 10900K's performance behaviour in this title. At 1440p, Intel still maintains the performance lead with the 10900K, and there is a little difference in Zen 2 and Zen 3 FPS numbers. Shadow of the Tomb Raider flips AMD Zen 3 back into another chart-topping result, and this time by a notable margin. This game clearly likes the cache and latency enhancements made to Zen 3, as proven by the drastic performance uptick versus Zen 2. At 1440p, the graphics workload is demanded enough to close the Zen 3 performance lead versus Intel, but AMD's new Ryzen chips still prove a better option for high refresh rate gamers than Zen 2. In the Division 2, Intel manages to switch the picture again with a chart-topping result from the Core i9-10900K. AMD's Zen 3 options are marginally lower FPS than the Intel mainstream offering, but the performance difference is unlikely to disappoint any potential Zen 3 buyers. Versus Zen 2, Zen 3 shows another reasonable performance uplift in both average FPS and 1% low FPS values. 1440p increases the graphics workload to the point where all chips perform basically the same. AMD Zen 3 really does close the gap to Intel to the point where it's more or less as good as the 10900K for gaming. It trades blows, Intel wins some, AMD wins others. Technically, the Intel Core i9-10900K is a little bit faster in our testing as it wins more of the charts, but realistically, they're going to be as good as each other in terms of high refresh rate gaming performance, and that is not the case with Zen 2 versus Comet Lake, so Zen 3 is really a massive improvement there. And if you're interested in 3D Mark time spy performance, AMD does well with Zen 3 in the 16-core form, but the 5900X cannot match the 10900K performance without a hefty overclock. Power consumption still proves to be an area where AMD does very well with Zen 3. The 16-core 5950X does not use its full 142-watt PPT allocation at stock, and therefore results in an impressive wall power draw number of less than 200 watts for the system. Removing the frequency shackles by applying PBO or a manual overclock highlights how the 16-core chip can indeed guzzle power if you let it do so, but this power draw increase is backed up rather convincingly with higher clock speeds and performance results. The 5900X draws more power than the 5950X because the 12-core chip runs at higher clock speeds and therefore uses more of its 142-watt PPT allocation. Still, the power draw numbers at stock are impressively low and make the processor easy to handle from a motherboard VRM, PSU and cooling perspective. It comes as absolutely no surprise to see the 5950X setting a new tier of performance per watt thanks to its Zen 3 IPC improvements at similar power draw levels. The 5900X also does extremely well to get to a power efficiency number of anywhere near the Zen 2 3950X in light of the new chip's core count deficit. Frankly, Intel cannot compete with this level of efficiency, as was the case with Zen 2, but Zen 3 just widens the margin. Pricing increases have been noted with Ryzen 5000 versus Ryzen 3000 and 3000 XT. However, the performance per pound metrics highlight that the price increases are in line with performance increases for the 12 and 16 core chips. Couple in the fact that performance improvements outside of Cinebench workloads are even higher. Examples there would be lightly threaded or gaming scenarios, and Ryzen 5000 actually looks to be very good from a value perspective. Load temperatures for the 5950X were surprisingly low, so much so that we rechecked the data with a different motherboard and an AIS CPU cooler. The numbers held true. AMD has done an excellent job in allowing the 16-core chip to run at easy-to-handle temperatures thanks to the modest operating clocks and low power consumption. Of course, PBO increases the operating temperature as expected, but even that automatic overclock and our hefty manual overclock were fine with a 280mm AIO cooler. The 5900X runs hotter than the 5950X at stock thanks to its higher operating clock speed and power draw. We do, however, continue to see the operating temperature decrease for our Zen 3 samples versus the comparable Zen 2 chips. This time, the PBO and 4.7 GHz manual overclock numbers were very comfortable on a 280mm AIO cooler and were also handled with relative ease using a Noctua NHD15S Chromax Black air cooler. From a temperature perspective, it looks like AMD's Zen 3 chips, even in these high core count parts, will not push you to extremes when it comes to thermal performance and cooling requirements, and that's a really important point because Intel made strides to improve the cooling on its 10900K, so good job AMD. As our testing show, we'd be equally happy using a big out-of-the-box AIO liquid cooler to handle these chips, or even a dual tower or other competitive air cooler if you prefer that approach. Don't think that you need to go to exotic and extreme cooling to get these pretty lofty frequencies out of the Zen 3 parts. I'd say this is a pretty simple one to summarize. Zen 3 in its Ryzen 5000 form delivers, and it delivers in spades. The performance is fantastic. It's absolutely superb. The architectural improvements of Zen 3, most notably obviously the 8-core CCX with the single 32MB slab of L3 cache in that CCX, and the under-the-hood design tweaks to improve latency and the process to enhance clock speeds, they all come together to create a superb blend on not only the 12-core part, but also the 16-core part. We were actually pleasantly surprised by how much uplift we saw in terms of multi-threaded performance and productivity performance, and not only game performance. So clearly the architectural improvements that AMD has applied are beneficial for actual users with real workloads and gamers alike. And that really is a strong point for Zen 3, because Zen 2 was always fantastic for productivity, but had the caveat whereas Intel was faster for gaming. That's not really the case now. Excellent for productivity, excellent for gaming. That's what Zen 3 boils down to. And then the overclocking and performance efficiency and just clock speeds in general actually really impressed us. So 4.7 gigahertz all-core overclocks with sensible voltages and sensible cooling are really very good. PBO actually worked very well because it allowed some of the power shackles to be removed, and we saw tangible frequency uplifts. So they're about 4.4, 4.5 gigahertz range on both the chips. And even out of the box, the 12-core in particular is running at some pretty lofty clock speeds for a 12-core chip. The 16-core, not so much, but you do get that overclocking headroom. And the reason I like this overclocking point is because it adds some fun back into owning and working with the processors. So not only do you get to overclock the Infinity Fabric like we had previously, but now you can actually tune the cores a bit and push some tangible gains, as we saw through our performance testing. If we focus on the competitive landscape and who should buy these chips, then with the Ryzen 9 5950X, in terms of competition, it doesn't really have any, quite frankly. As far as I'm concerned, the Ryzen 9 5950X is a very, very good solution. And if you need this level of chip, it's not even worth considering saving the £80 or so and getting the 3950X. This should be the go-to option. It really is a fantastic chip with no clear negatives whatsoever. And then if we look at the Ryzen 9 5900X, now this sits in a bit more of a competitive landscape. And that's because it's priced at about £510 in the UK. That makes it about £40 cheaper than the Core i9 10900K, and it convincingly is a better option than the 10900K. The £60 to £70 price increase versus the previous 12-core Zen 2 parts, it is a real chunk of money. That gets you a good 500 gig NVMe SSD, or maybe an upgrade from 16 to 32 gigs of DDR4. With that said, I think the performance improvements for Zen 3 in this Ryzen 9 5900X form are justifiable, just as they were with the 5950X. If you do want to pay a bit more for that better productivity performance but can't quite stretch to the 16-core chip, and if you want good gaming performance on the side, the Ryzen 9 5900X really is a smart solution, even if it does have a price increase versus the 12-core parts that it's fundamentally replacing. And then versus the Core i9 10850K, of which I have here, let me just grab that. I still like the 5900X. This 10850K is about £70 cheaper in the UK, and we can assume its performance based on the test results for the 10900K in our data. So what that means is basically the 5900X is going to be beating it quite convincingly most of the time, but it will be a tough competitor when it comes to gaming. With that said, the £70 cheaper, even if you're a gamer, that can quickly be gobbled up by a more expensive Z490 motherboard compared to decent B550 solutions. And the fact that you've got better productivity performance and a better overall platform from AM4, I think again that makes it a pretty strong argument for the Ryzen 9 5900X in this competition. But anyway, I think that summarizes it quite nicely. Both of these chips look like really competitive options. The 5950X is pretty much a no-brainer if you need this level of performance. It's absolutely superb. And the 5900X really does offer compelling performance at a £510 reasonable price point. Even if the Zen 2 12 cores are a bit cheaper, the performance uptick that you see here really does make it a standout product at this price point. So very happy here. AMD has basically delivered some really promising improvements with Zen 3, even versus Zen 2, which was already a very compelling and competitive architecture. Basically, Zen 3 represents a significant addition to AMD's product stack, and it goes some way in really hammering home the point that AMD is the dominant force in the CPU market right now. Intel really is going to have a tough job competing against these new Zen 3 chips, even from a price perspective. The value, the performance, the platform, the clock speed, the gaming, all very, very promising. I think when we also factor in the improved clock speed frequencies that we've been seeing from the new Zen 3 chips, especially in terms of manual overclocking, this really is complete domination of the mainstream CPU markets. Zen 3, based on the 12 and 16 core, is really promising from my testing, and I'm excited to see what the 8 and 6 core CPUs bring. Check back for that. I've been Luke Hill for Kick Guru. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you liked it. Let us know what you think in the comments section down below. Is Zen 3 going to be the next upgrade for you? Are you going to upgrade from your older AMD processor? Are you switching from Intel? Are you buying brand new into the AM4 and Zen 3 platform? Let us know what you think. Comment section down below. If you like this video, give us a like, subscribe, hit the bell icon. Check out the main written article over on the Kick-Guru website. That really helps us out and you get more detail over there. And if you want to support us, head on over to the Patreon page and our merch store. And I'll catch you in the next one.